Thank you, Philip, for the introduction. And I would also like to express my gratitude to the Department of Global and International Studies in the School of Social Sciences for having me here. And I want to thank all of you for coming, especially coming at this hour for this particular topic. It's dinner time, and we are going to talk about food without food. So my apologies, but nonetheless, food is a very important, and it's a fitting topic for people who study international studies, because food is a very important part of the globalization process, and through food we can really understand, how the world changes. And so this is why at the corner of the slide here, you see the line, travels and evolution of taste. Taste does travel along with the process of globalization and along with the changes of the world. Okay, so but my topic is more focused. Okay, it's going to be focused on the development, the history of Chinese food in the U.S. But it's a story that I'm going to tell in a global context. Okay, and since we're talking about food without food, to compensate that, I would like to invite you to stop me to ask questions during my lecture. And at the end of my lecture, we'll have more time for Q&A. All right. So I'm going to start with the question of how Chinese is America's Chinese food, right? So this is a question that I have been asked many times ever since I started the project. I started to work on this many years ago, and this is also a question that people often ask in other contexts. So let's watch a video very briefly to get introduced to this question.
The United States is home to more than 41,000 Chinese restaurants, but many Americans may not be aware of how authentic the food at their favorite place may be.
Chicken and broccoli, beef and broccoli.
Chicken with broccoli, I love chicken with broccoli.
Dim sum, I love bao.
I like Szechuan.
My favorite Chinese food is when I'm in China.
CCTV America visited Chinatown Garden, a DC Chinese restaurant, to learn the differences between Americanized Chinese food and authentic Chinese food.
我们这里的餐厅呢，因为我们是有游客和这个当地的美国人，所以我们有川菜和这广东菜都有。美国人来啊，我们也分就给这些外国人吃的。中国人来，我们会另外给他一份中国人的菜，和我们中国人口味的菜。做美国人的菜，一般性的厨师啊，大家都会做，因为很简单，就是说蔬菜和肉，然后弄熟之后，一般性就不要又蒸又煮什么的。广东菜啊是有一些技巧的，所以比较炒这个中国人吃的菜啊，基本上都会做美国人的菜。
北京烤鸭，这个还是很适合于美国人口味。
说什么都行，但不能说你也得
因为烤的东西嘛，又是肉的东西，也比较有点甜，味道比较正，应该还是都挺喜欢吃的。
确定吗？你这个。
哎呀，多少的工序才能做出那个最好的水啊？所以把那一桌给它。
Real Chinese food may not look familiar to those used to Americanized Chinese food. The cooking styles and tastes of food in China vary tremendously by region. For example, Cantonese food can be sweet, while Sichuan food is known for its spiciness. Here is a tip. Many Chinese restaurants have an unpublished Chinese menu that includes more authentic dishes. Ask for it and try out some real dishes of China.
Right, the video is about the central question of my lecture today, but it also raises more questions, right? Like who has the authority to decide what is authentic and what is not? Because in the video, you can see very clearly that people, Chinese and non-Chinese, divide the Chinese food that they have into two categories. Those for the real authentic Chinese food for Chinese customers and the Americanized, non-authentic Chinese food for non-Chinese customers. Okay, so so keep that in mind. Who has the authority to judge, right? And on the screen you can see the outline, a very ambitious outline. Okay, I don't know if I would be able to finish everything that I plan to talk about within the next 40 or 45 minutes. But that's the plan, right? So I'm going to start with why this question is important to explore what is authentic and what is not authentic Chinese food. Why this is an important a question. Then I'm going to try to define a critical concept, a concept that is essential to any discussions of issues of authenticity, especially culinary authenticity, which is the concept of the word cuisine, and then I'll discuss some basic features of the cooking of China, and from there I'll discuss move on to the development of Chinese food in the U.S. And towards the end of my lecture, I'll return to the question, how Chinese is America's Chinese food, and then I'll take a global, a diasporic approach to that question, right? And after that, you can go to dinner, okay? Maybe to a Chinese restaurant, okay? So that's the plan, yeah. But I cannot plan for your dinner tonight. I can only plan for the lecture that I want to deliver here. Right? So there are many reasons why the opening question is so important. In the following, I'm going to talk about two, right? Which will illustrate the point that I made at the beginning of today's lecture, which is that food is very, very important for us to develop a global perspective. And it is a very, very important part of the globalization process, right? So I'm going to talk about only four reasons here. And the first one is that the first reason why this question is important is because the story of the development of Chinese food is an integral part of the history of Chinese Americans. Okay, the arrival of Chinese food in the U.S. coincided with the landing of the first wave of Chinese immigrants in the U.S., beginning in the gold rush, right, back in the mid-19th century, and in subsequent decades, food has remained a very, very vital part of the cultural, the economic, as well as the political experiences of Chinese Americans. Right? It was through food that many Chinese Americans were able to make a living. Right? I should note that up to the 1970s, right, there were only two, for most Chinese Americans, there were only two occupational opportunities. Right? They could either run a laundry shop, or they could work in the restaurant business. Other than that, very few other choices for Chinese Americans, right? So the food experiences of Chinese Americans, right, also showed, helped to illustrate another important part of their history, which is the tremendous discrimination that they faced. Okay, so it's a very important part of the Chinese American history. So by exploring this question about the authenticity of Chinese food, we can gain a better understanding of the experiences of Chinese Americans, and then to investigate the culinary authenticity of Chinese American of Chinese food, right? It helps us to place the story of Chinese food and the history of Chinese Americans in a global context, right? If we don't do that, right, we won't be able to understand. We won't be able to answer that question, right? By the same token, if we don't do that, we won't be able to understand the development of cuisines like Italian food, Indian food, and so on, and so forth. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next slide, to the third and fourth reasons why this topic, this question is so important. Okay. Because to explore this question, we really have to look at the experiences of Chinese Americans as part of another context, the context of the Chinese diaspora. Right? This is one of the oldest, one of the longest lasting diasporas in the world. Okay? The word diaspora started with the dispersal of Jewish communities throughout the world. Okay, and that's the Jewish diaspora, the Chinese diaspora. Now you have the Korean diaspora, Italian, and so on, and so forth. That's another sort of a kind of a global perspective for us to keep in mind when we try to see our world through global perspectives. Finally, right, as I've argued in other places, in other contexts, right, the expansion of Chinese food is also a very important part of American history. Right? It demonstrates, it helps us to better understand the transformation of American society and the emergence of the U.S., the United States, as perhaps the world's first consumer society, right? So in other words, to explore that question and to understand the development of Chinese food can help us better understand the lifestyle that we all enjoy today as American citizens or as people who live in the U.S. Okay, this is a lifestyle that has spread to many parts of China, of the world, including China. Okay, so those are some of the reasons why it is so important to explore this question. But before we do that, though, right, we need to define a very critical concept, an essential concept, that is cuisine. Okay, this is a word that we often use, but we seldom think about, what it really means. We really, very few of us make a systematic and conscious effort to define that term, and there are exceptions. Encyclopedia Britannica is one of those. Right? So here on the screen you have a passage from the definition that you can find in Encyclopedia Britannica. I'm not going to repeat what you can see on the screen, but I would like to move on to talk about the 5 fundamental elements in the concept of cuisine. The definition that you just saw in the previous slide reveals the first 3 of the 5, right? So first, the spatial dimensions of a cuisine, especially in the beginning. A cuisine is always tied to a physical location, a physical community, maybe a village, or and then it's expanding geographical location. From a village to a county, a town, a city, a province, a region, and a nation, right? But the geographical connection here is very important, right? Because that's how a cuisine is defined and evolved. But because it depends on the ingredients that could be found within the confines of that geographical location. Okay, and but a cuisine is not simply about the ingredients. I mean, ingredients are very important, right? Don't get me wrong. So what is also important, nonetheless, is how those ingredients are prepared, are cooked, and are combined, are mixed. Okay, that's what we call cooking methods, right? Through that, we can also gain an understanding shared by the people in that region, about the relationships among those cuisines, right? Certain ingredients won't go with certain things, right? And so it's also something that helps us understand their understanding of their own relationship to the foods, to the foodstuffs around them. Okay. So cooking methods, right? The third one has to do with the level of economic development of a region, right? Engels, one of the co-founders of the ideology of Marxism, said that in order to survive, for human beings to survive, a society must produce sufficient food, right? And for a society to create a culture, a cuisine, perhaps, right, which is a very important part of a culture, a society must produce more than, more food than the basic needs require, right? So I want to extend that argument to argue that in order for a cuisine to emerge, you need a certain level of economic prosperity, right? Because a cuisine is not just simply about providing food to support our body, right? Enough calories. It's more than that. It is about our appreciation of food as art. It is about how to express our emotions, like our love for our children, right, or for your parents. Okay, and so this is why the Song Dynasty, which is one of the at certain moments one of the most prosperous dynasties it's not the entire dynasty period, but there are critical moments in which and critical locations too, in which China experienced extraordinary prosperity. Okay, and the prosperity did not happen throughout the Song Dynasty, and the prosperity did not happen throughout the China at the time, right? It happened in cities, in cities, right? Where even to this day, wealth is concentrated and found. Okay, so when we think of cuisine, cuisines, Italian food, Korean food, we tend to think about physical objects, right? A particular dish, Kung Pao chicken or Peking duck. How many of you love Peking duck? A sushi, and so on and so forth, right? But I want to remind you, I want to argue here that the notion cuisine is also an idea, a consciousness, a state of mind, a state of mind. And the meaning of this is twofold. Okay. First, what that means is that for a cuisine to exist, to develop, okay, it has to be recognized, okay, has to be articulated by insiders, okay, and this is very, very, very important, right? So people, in order for the people of a community to have a cuisine, they need to be self-conscious of their cooking traditions as a shared a practice, right? So you mean so in other words, the development of a cuisine is very critical for the development of a community, right? Whether it's a village or it's a nation, right? A nation cannot exist without national consciousness, right? So and a very revealing case is the development of India as a nation after it declared independence from Britain after World War II, right? And one of the things that the Indian nationalists did before and after independence is to articulate, to cultivate a sense of a shared mission, a sense of a shared identity among Indians, right? So that what is now India can be forged into, developed into a nation, right? And one of the things that people did was to articulate a national cuisine of India, okay? Through, when we, for communities, what happens is, people share recipes, right? We still do that. Hey, I saw a very nice video on a recipe on YouTube when I shared that with you, right? But people share that with on a piece of paper, right? And then when we have more than one pieces of paper, we turn them into a book, a cookbook. That's what happened in post-independence India in the 1960s and the 70s. Okay, so that's a demonstration of a self-consciousness, okay, in the development of a cuisine. But self-consciousness alone, in my view, is not enough for a cuisine to become a cuisine in a global context, right? So the second part of this is that in order for a cuisine to become such, it needs also to be recognized by outsiders. Actually, all cuisines exist because of recognitions by outsiders. Okay, so. Here is one example of that. Okay. So the articulation of the effort to define Chinese food happened in the US more than it happened in China. Okay. I hope you have read the article that I've sent to the class. In the article, I talk about the unprecedented extent to which Chinese Americans try to define the meaning of Chinese food. So since we already talked about that, I'm not going to dwell on this, to spend too much time on this. Okay, so so two things help to promote cuisines among outsiders. First, cookbooks, right? And then restaurants, okay? So, but these two institutions promote a cuisine in different ways. As we can tell from the case of Chinese food. So if you compare the two, right? You know, in the context of its development in the U.S., we had Chinese restaurants first, long before we had cookbooks about Chinese food, right? And the motivations are also very different. Why do you want to open a restaurant? No, it's not because you want to be a culinary cultural ambassador. No, you want to make some money or make a living, right? A restaurant, after all, is not a museum. So motivation is different. And then another difference is in terms of the kind of customers that come to the restaurants. Right? For a long time, until the turn of the 20th century, Chinese restaurants in the U.S. served primarily a Chinese clientele. By comparison, the cookbooks were intended primarily for non-Chinese customers. They were published in English, and for a long time, many Chinese Americans had a very limited English language skills. Okay, and the restaurants were available primarily in urban spaces. Okay. You know, dining out to this day, it remains a very urban activity. By comparison, cookbooks penetrate all different parts of the country. Okay, and cookbook writers also have more freedom to talk about their food. By comparison, the Chinese restaurants, what they can offer, right, are very limited. Many years ago, I helped a friend to open a Chinese restaurant. What kind of food you want to offer? That's one of the questions that we have to think about from the very beginning. And I also worked with the first Chinese restaurant that offered drive-through service. Okay, but failed not because of me, failed nonetheless, right? But what we did was to try to limit the number of dishes that the restaurant should offer, right? So, but in writing a cookbook, right, you can write about 1,000 dishes, right? As many as you want. And the final comparison is also very interesting. Okay, last week, a TV station in Spain contacted me, asked me, what foods are mainly are only for men, or only men can make, or women cannot, right? But that's related to the last category. Okay, so in terms of who runs, who owns, and who works in a restaurant, it's in the restaurant space, it's a predominantly male space for a long time, and by comparison, the writing of Chinese food cookbooks was done primarily by women. Okay, very fascinating gender questions coming out of this conversation. Okay, food is always gendered, right? Until recently, you seldom saw macho men eating a bowl of greens, right? It's always barbecue, a lot of meat. Okay, the gender dimension of food. Okay, and the last element that defines a cuisine is that food. It's food. A cuisine never and could not exist in isolation. Okay, it always evolves as a result of interactions with the foods, with the cooking practices of other communities, of other nations. So this is why food is such an important global and international studies topic. So food is always about interactions. I don't know when was the last time you cooked an elaborate banquet for yourself, right? And I never did that. Food is about sharing. Food is about encounters. We get to know a new city, a new community when we travel, a new nation, first and foremost, often through food. Okay, And that's how cuisines emerge and evolve. Okay. Very unfamiliar foreign foodstuffs, can become the fundamental aspects of a cuisine. Okay. History does change. That was me. Back in the mid 1980s, for all of you, that's ancient history, I know, but it did happen, at Cornell, okay, and but that's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the third part of my lecture, okay. So what is Chinese food, after all, right? We talk about some elements, right? It needs to be recognized by insiders and outsiders, and it needs to have a geographical location, coherence, right? And shared cooking practices, right? China has all that, right? It's a sort of a geographical concept and has been recognized by many outsiders as well as insiders for a long time. But here, again, is why the need for cuisine to be recognized by outsiders is so critical, right? I grew up in China, and I was eating Chinese food since I was born, right? But I never used the word Chinese to describe the food that I had, right? Because there was no other food, right? No foreign food. Okay, and so the adjectives that we use to characterize a cuisine, those are basically comparing what the differences between our cuisine and yours. Okay, I never used that word until I came to the U.S. And then I realized, oh my God, and there's Thai food, there's Japanese food, which I started to appreciate very much, Italian, Greek, and so on, and so forth. So I started to use that word, not because I had any sort of cultural awakening, a moment of cultural awakening about develop a profound understanding all of a sudden of the meaning of Chinese food. No, I use that word. Basically not to describe what Chinese food was, but what it was not. Okay, and going back to the fact that Chinese food is one of the longest lasting cuisines of the world, one of the most sophisticated. Okay, and I want to add a footnote here, right? As in order to illustrate the sophisticated and long-standing origin of Chinese food, right? If you until very recently, in the last few years, okay, if you ask food experts in the U.S. and for that matter in the West, where did the restaurant institution start? They will tell you the first restaurant started in Paris during the French Revolution. When a lot of young men went to Paris to join the revolution or to witness the revolution, during that very turbulent moment, right? A lot of young men were there. They need something to eat, and they also developed a mental condition so they went to the restaurant for kind of a medicinal syrup, okay, and then eventually they would go there for food. But that's not true in a global context, right? The Chinese created what we call today restaurants long before the French Revolution, okay, in places like Hangzhou, a city that Marco Polo visited and loved and admired, okay. So what is Chinese food, right? We won't be able to do that, to define that today, right? You have to go to dinner at 6 o'clock. But we can talk about two fundamental features, okay? And that goes back to the fact that when I was growing up, eating Chinese food, right, every day, I never used the word Chinese to describe my food. One of the reasons is also the first feature of Chinese food. So this is, so Chinese food, it has a great reputation, right? It achieved that not because of a dominant imperial, a single cuisine, no. It achieved that tremendous reputation because of the multiple regional cuisines. So basically it's a combination of many different regional cuisines. Okay, so this is a feature, by the way, also shared by Italian food. Okay, very good, very good food, but it's not it's very different from French cooking. There's no haute cuisine. There's no imperial national cuisine. Indian food, in spite of all the facts, of all the efforts made by the nationalists and cookbook writers in the 70s and 60s to articulate a national cuisine, right? It's a combination. It's a mixture of different regional cuisines, and Chinese food is like that. Okay, so what's the consequence of that, right? The result is that for a long time, few people have bothered to define. Okay, so I'm going to give you three examples. Right, the first one is from the Qin dynasty. Okay, and the example that I'm going to use here in that example is a very famous, tremendous foodie by the name of Yuan Mei. Okay, so I don't know how many of you read Chinese. He's also a great writer. Okay, and traveled all over the country for many years. To collect, to taste, and eventually to write about the food of China. Right, but he never used the term the term Chinese food or Chinese to describe the food that he has tasted. Okay, so move on to the beginning to the end of the Qin dynasty, the beginning of the Republic era. The founder of the Republic of China, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, and he was one of the few people who have loudly and extensively elaborated on his pride in Chinese food. Okay, but he never talked about what constitutes Chinese food. What makes the food of China Chinese, right? And this lack of effort to define that continued, right? And it's because of the fact that I mean, because of this first feature of the cooking of China. It's highly regionalized, okay, and so highly regionalized that as late as the 1920s and 30s, and even 40s, right? People in Shanghai, for example, called all non-Shanghai cooking practices foreign food. Okay, it's not it's not only not Chinese, it's foreign. Okay, and second feature, right? It's a cuisine, actually, like any other cuisine. Chinese cooking has never stopped evolving. So, those features are very profound, very central, fundamental in our effort to understand the question, what is authentic Chinese food? Okay. So, if you think about it, a lot of the the fundamental, essential ingredients in Chinese cooking, right? In the bird's nest. How many of you have tasted a bird's nest? If you haven't, there's no need to bother. Okay, I won't tell you why. Yeah, but it's they have become but they are called signature dishes of Chinese cuisine, right? People, when people want to show how proud they are of Chinese cooking, they talk about those the treasures, and that's one of them, right? And but all this food, the foodstuffs and many more that you see on the screen come from the outside, right? The bird's nest come from the islands along the coast of Southeast Asian countries, like Indonesia. They were not introduced to China until the Tang Dynasty. Did not become popular until much later. Okay, but now we think, oh, they're so Chinese. Yes or no, right? Depending on the time period you talk about. So this is why, cuisines like Chinese food has never stopped evolving, right? It's through trade, it's through immigration, it's through invasions, through diplomatic activities and so on and so forth, right? But what's unique about the ever expansion of Chinese cooking practices, okay, is the last one, right? It's the creation of the Chinese diaspora, okay, throughout the world, okay, and so in the diaspora, right, the Chinese communities in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, people brought their traditional Chinese cooking practices to those places, right? And blended them with the local traditions. Okay, so that's the result is the creation of more or less fusion cookings. In the case of Southeast Asia, the Baba cuisine. In the case of Peru, the Chifa cuisine. Okay, that's the second feature. 10 minutes. Okay. All right. 10? Is it 10?
More or less.
10 minutes or hours?
10 minutes.
10? Okay, thank you. Yeah. Don't worry, it's 10 minutes. It's not 10 hours.
I have
Okay.
to call in dinner if it's 10 hours.
All right. Okay. So I talked about this in my book, but after its arrival, Chinese food was rejected by Americans for about half a century, and all of a sudden, at the turn of the 20th century, it became very popular, and beginning in the 1980s, has become probably the single most popular cuisine in the U.S. And if you go to a museum exhibit, for which I serve as the advisor, just to show my name here. Okay, sorry. Let me go back here. Yeah, there are over 50,000 Chinese restaurants in the U.S. So what that means is that for every 10,000 residents in the U.S., there's a Chinese restaurant, or for every 15 restaurants, one of them is a Chinese one. Okay, so and that what happened is that in the mid 20th century. You have the bifurcation of Chinese food, right? One for Chinese customers, the other for non-Chinese. Okay, and I was going to show you how to read this menu, right? Many are fascinating cultural narrative documents. Okay, but I won't. But so that bifurcation has been articulated by Chinese Americans themselves, including the practitioners of Chinese food in the U.S. So what happened was that it's not a choice made by Chinese Americans. It's a choice made by Chinese by the customers of Chinese food in the U.S. Okay, so you have shark fins representing the sort of old cuisine of China, fine dining Chinese food. The other one by chop suey, the sort of home cooking, right? And it's the one represented by chop suey that won. Okay, it was a choice made by American customers, and you may wonder why. There are fascinating reasons that I won't be able to go over. That's why that's the case. Okay, but what's interesting is that the customers who made the choice, okay, they were not middle class, they were not upper class. Okay, they were Americans who on the margins. Okay, so African Americans, marginalized Jews. Okay, and also you have immigrants like the Jews. The connection between Jewish Americans and Chinese food has been a legendary story. And I have to show this clip. Okay, I know I'm running out of time, but I have to risk that to show this one because this is a
Christmas Day bomber. Where are you at on Christmas Day? Senator Graham, that is an undecided legal issue.
Okay, so she was nominated for the Supreme Court, right? Questioned by John Graham, a Republican senator, hostile to Democrat nominations, and she's Jewish, and so that tense moment. Okay, so she's asking where she was last Christmas, right? And she thought it's a very serious legal question.
Which, I suppose I should ask exactly what you mean by that. I'm assuming that the question you mean is whether a person who was apprehended in the United States is...
No, I just asked you where you're at on Christmas.
Like all Jews, I was probably at a Chinese restaurant.
Great answer.
That connection, that kind of connection. Okay. So as a result of this bifurcation, you have the emergence of what we call Chinese American cuisine, a word also used by Chinese American Chinese food practitioners. Okay. So here are some characteristics of that cuisine. It's a restaurant cuisine. Okay, whether restaurants can develop cuisines, that's a whole other story for another debate that we won't be able to have today. Okay, and second, I don't know how many of you love American fast food, right? Don't have to tell me now. Okay, Chinese food is the predecessor of American fast food. In a sense that it's the first commercialized, highly commercialized, streamlined cuisine for mass consumption at a national level throughout the country. Okay, and so very simple dishes, and it is affordable and very convenient. Sounds like a McDonald's, right? But it's not. It's Chinese food. Okay, so how Chinese that is, that food. So here is in the last 5 minutes. Bear with me. My argument is that in terms of the extent to which it's commercialized, in terms of the fact that it was America's first highly commercialized cuisine, it is very American. It's about the new consumer society lifestyle, but in terms of cooking methods, in terms of people's perception, how it is recognized, it is still very much very Chinese. Okay, so and then along those lines, if you want to understand that, the nature of Chinese American food, it is another diasporic cuisine that the Chinese developed in the diaspora. Compared to the Baba cuisine, compared to Chifa cooking, Chinese American cooking is more Chinese. then so it's not a hybrid cooking, right? I'm going to stop here, and thank you so much for being so patient with me. And that's it. Yeah, thank you.